Hey, Liam here from Digiwaza Multimedia. Thanks for joining me on this Blender 2.82 tutorial. In this episode, we're going to be discussing how to create a texture set using the software Quixel Mixer 2020. It's still a beta software. It's pretty new, but it's pretty cool. I thought we'd take a look at it. And then we will, in the second part of this video, put this texture on a plane in the Cycles render engine in Blender. So without further ado, let's get going. When we first open a file in Quixel Mixer 2020, this is what we'll see. We can come right here where it says New Mix and click on it, and it'll allow us to name it. I'm going to simply name this one Ground and keep it simple. And we'll be working at 2048. You saw it at the beginning there. As soon as you push enter, it jumps into the viewer, the user interface here. Working resolution, we're going to be working at 2048, as you can see right over here. We're in the setup window, so we're going to be working at 2048 to give our graphics card a break. The type of model that we're working on is going to be a plane, so we're just going to leave it just how it is. If we were bringing in something more complicated, like some kind of object we'd modeled in Blender, we would change this to custom mesh, but we're going to leave it plain. And we're going to leave the size 2 by 2 meters. Okay. Let's go through real quickly, just a real quick overview of the user interface. I really like, one of the things I noticed right off the bat about this software is I really like how clean and streamlined the user interface is. There's not a huge amount of stuff here. It's not overwhelming when you first look at it, and it looks deceptively simple. So let's go through it real quick. I'm going to start at the top here. File, it's the usual stuff you'd expect here. Edit, same thing. Library, this is in reference to the Megascan library, which Quixel owns. It's a giant library of photo scanned objects, materials, all that kind of stuff. It's pretty impressive, and these photo scanned materials really look good. So this is basically a way, this software, Quixel Mixer, is a way that we can take those assets and mix them together into new materials or custom materials for our objects, for video game environments or video game objects, or just regular 3D software like Blender. All right, cool. And then experimental here, it says generate normals. I'm guessing that we're going to be able to, if we can't already, they're going to be doing something like Substance Painter, which allows us to paint on a normal channel, which allows us to just create normal maps. Okay, so that's all we really need to know about that. Let's go down to the next layer here. Viewport. Viewport is what we see right here. If we click on viewport, we'll get the whole viewport. The next one is called local libraries. If I click on that, we can see that it takes us into what's called our local library. Our local library is where we have the assets that are downloaded into Quixel Mixer 2020 that we have access to. Now, it comes with a bunch of these assets already in it for free. I don't know if I mentioned that this is a free software, but it also allows us to go online and access the Quixel Mixer or the Quixel Megascan library, which has thousands and thousands of various assets. Now, if you sign up for an Epic Games account for the Unreal Engine and then use that to sign in and download Quixel, you'll be able to access the entire suite, the entire library, Megascan library, and use this software totally for free. If you're going to use it in a different game engine like Unity or something, you're going to have to pay, I think it's $30 a month in order to access the Megascan library. So if you don't already have an account with Epic Games, I would suggest you sign up. It's free, and the Unreal Engine is super cool to play around with if you haven't done that yet. Anyways, this is the assets that are loaded in so far. These are the ones that just come with Quixel Mixer 2020. The next section here, if I click it, my internet's a little bit slow at home here. You'll see that we actually now can access the Megascan library. And if you look over in this left column, you can see that there's 11,235 assets in this library. Again, if you sign in with your Epic's game account, you can use these for free, and that is pretty cool. And these are really good looking textures here. I've actually really enjoyed playing around with this. You can see As I scan through, there's actual objects, bricks, chain links, tree branch. There's a bunch of just interesting assets that are in here that you can use for free. All right, so let's move on. I'm going to go back to the one that says viewport, and we'll come back to the viewport. Down here, we're working in a physically based rendering metalness workflow, which is kind of an industry standard. This is by default what Substance Painter uses as well. So we'll just leave it there. We do have a bunch of other options on what we can work on, but we're just going to leave it here by default. This next one here is we can select what kind of a mesh we want to preview our texture on. If I left click it, we can see we're using a plane now, but if we click here on sphere, we can make it into a sphere. This is how a lot of people show off their textures, so you could use this if you want. We're making a ground plane, kind of a generic square texture, so I'm going to go back to the plane. All right, the next little item here is a preview displacement. It's on by default, which means that as we create our texture set, we will be able to see what the displacement's doing to our plane. Now, it's going to create a displacement map that we can use, and when we go back into Blender in the second part of this video, we will have to use this in the Cycles render engine because the Eevee render engine at this point doesn't support displacement in the way that the Unreal Engine or the Cycles engine does. Cycles render engine. All right, let's move on. This is preview tiling. This will show us how our texture's tiling. And then this one here, we can have a grid floor. If we click on it, it'll show the grid floor like we're used to in Blender. All right, I'm going to turn that off though because it's a little distracting. All right, if we move over here, we can see that we have our selected camera view. So if I click here, we have perspective, top view, bottom view, all of these things. These are pretty common. You use the numpad in Blender, as you know. I'm not going to really use these for this project. I'm just going to move around within the environment here. And the way we do that is very similar to Substance Painter. We hold down the Alt key, and then we can left click, and we can scan around. We can also hold down the Alt click, middle mouse button, and grab. And then finally, of course, the scroll wheel scrolls in and out. So Alt is necessary and left click. Okay, enough of that. Let's move on. We already talked about setup as we got in here. Working resolution, we're working at 2048. We can change this at any time, and we'll change this to 4096 at the end. We already are using a plane, and we talked about how you could add in a more complex model by just changing the setting. All right. We're going to be working mainly in this one that says layers, but let's check these other ones real quick. If I hit display, we can see that the background right now we're using a gradient, which is the one I like. You see it's kind of light gray to dark gray. If we click on it, we can see that we also have flat. It's just a flat color. And we also have skybox. Skybox gives us kind of a HDRI to use. Now we can blur out the background if we want using the skybox. And we can change field of view, that kind of thing. I'm going to leave all that the same, and I'm going to go back to gradient because that's the one I find most pleasant. All right, we can also change the lighting, brightness, and then we can also rotate the light. By the way, while we're in this part here, we can hold down the Shift key and right click, and we can change our light. You can see over here it's rotating as I do it. So Shift key and right click and move my mouse around, and I'm also rotating the light. Okay, cool. I'm not going to go into any of these other ones. They're not really that important for this project. Performance, again, this is generalized stuff about the performance of the software based on your computer. I'm not going to go into that very much. Export at the end, we'll export and we'll talk about that one. Okay, so let's get back over here to this one that says layers. Click on it. All right, so this is a semi-familiar looking format. We have a layer stack. We're going to have our layers all stacked up here. It works like regular layers. We have a base layer by default that we can turn off or turn on. And then as we stack layers in, the one that is at the bottom is obviously going to be under all of the other layers. We can add layers by adding, right here, we can add a surface layer. We can add a decal or an atlas layer. We can add a solid layer, a liquid layer, a noise layer, and finally a paint layer. We'll get into each of these here in just a little bit. Okay, and then right here, this is going to be the place where we see the controls for whatever layer is selected. This layer is selected, and we can tell because it has this blue line right there. And so this is a very simple layer so far. Once we start adding masks and stuff onto it, it'll get a little more complicated. And then we'll have to select each subcomponent of that layer. It's very similar to Substance Painter in that aspect. And then, of course, these are the channels that we're creating over here that we're working on. And everything in this column will be the controls or parameters or however you want to say it based on whatever component or layer we have selected. Okay, so right now it's just base layer. You can see it says base layer. This is all the info we need. Okay, cool. That's about all we need to do to start up. I'm going to hit the eye here, which of course will turn that channel's visibility off. And let's get to work. So I'm going to come right here to this one right here. It says add surface layer. Let's give it a click. Once we do that, we come into our local library. We can see over here. And we have the option of picking a bunch of these materials that are already made for us, which is really cool. And the Megascan library is pretty awesome. It has just hundreds, if not thousands, of these photo scan textures that look really, really good. I think that's the main strength of this software is their textures really look good. Okay, and we can see over here we have a bunch of options. It tells us how many assets we have loaded in each category. And we can also come right here where it says surface. And we have the option of checking for the types of things that we want to use. We could use smart materials if I click there. These are a bunch of materials, similar again to Substance Painter, where they have materials that they've already built that you can really just throw on objects and they look pretty good. They have metal wear, edge wear, dings, rust, various things. So they have lots of materials here that you could just throw on no problem. And I think they have, again, hundreds or thousands of these, which is pretty cool. And then you can also make your own. I'm not going to get into that though. All right, so I'm going to come back over here and just go to surfaces again. And the first one we're going to add is going to be this one right here, Rock Cliff Layered 2. Now this is in there by default. This comes with the way you download it. So if we simply left click it, we wait just a second, it takes a second to load, and there it is. It's on our plane. And boy, does that look good. These photo scan textures are pretty awesome. And as you can see, it comes in. Since, again, we're in preview displacement mode is on, we can see the displacement that it's causing to our mesh, which is pretty cool. Again, if we turn that off, we can see the texture flat. In case we're going to be using this in something that doesn't support displacement, we can take a look at it flat. I'm going to turn it back on because I think it just looks way cooler that way. All right, cool. So we have our first material. Let's talk about what we just did. We added this layer. Here it is. It's selected because it's blue. And now we can see it's rock cliff layered. And now we have all of these controls down the left side, or the right side, sorry. So what does all this mean? Well, this first section that says blend all the way down to this placement, this whole section is how this layer is going to interact with other layers. We can have it blend from below or from above. And so we're going to leave it from below for right now. And we'll talk about that again here in just a little bit when we add some more materials. The opacity of it, that's obvious. Threshold is going to, again, tell us how it mixes in with the other layers, which we'll see here in just a bit when we add our next material. All right. And then we have this one down here, placement. If we click the arrow, it'll open up. If you've used any kind of 3D software before, even in Blender, this would be like a texture mapping node that allows you to change the repetitions. Like if I crank this up, you'll see that I can make this tile all over the place here by changing these repetitions on the X and Y. I'm going to take that back to just 1 and 1. We can offset it if we want, and then we can also rotate it. So these are all pretty self-explanatory. Take your time to mess around with it and get it just how you like it. Okay, and then the next one down is high frequency. If we click on that, we see that we have high frequency, low frequency, and threshold. High frequency refers to the small, fine details of our object. I'm going to come in here so we can see it. As I adjust it, you'll see that we get more detail on those small objects. Now, one thing that I noticed that it does here is it pulls and does this weird stuff that starts to look kind of weird. I don't think it should be turned up this high, but you're the artist, you do what you like. I'm going to bring this back down just a little bit, probably somewhere in the middle here. And then, of course, low frequency is in reference to the larger details or the macro parts of it. And if we kick that up, you can see we can actually just increase the size of the larger details. So pretty awesome. And then let's kick that up just a little bit more. I'll come back and adjust this here too. And then threshold, we see that we get a little bit of change here and there. You can mess with that at your will. And again, these are the channels that we're working on. If we want to change the color scheme here, we can come down to this one that says albedo. And as you probably know already, an albedo it's the colors of our object without any shadow data. And that's important in 3D modeling because we don't want to have built-in shadows. Otherwise, we have to rotate our texture around to try to match the lighting in our scene. We'd much rather have it with no shadow data so that we can use the lights in our 3D software of choice. So albedo just means the colors of our scene or our object, but with no shadow data. And if we just click this little dot, left click, we'll get this color picker and we can actually change the colors if we want. And it's not going to change them all, but it's going to kind of change the color scheme, and then we can just hit apply. Okay, cool. You can also change the color, or it would basically be in black and white. Same with the roughness. If we wanted to make this real shiny, we could come to our roughness. It's up in the white, which generally, as in Blender, is more in the dull side. But if I bring this down into the black a lot, we can actually see that we've made it super shiny and it looks really wet. I'm going to bring this back up into the white zone. I want it to just look like regular rock, and then we can apply. Okay, cool. And then it's creating these other channels for us, and at the end we can assign which maps we want to have out in our texture set. Okay, so that's a quick look at what's going to be in this right-hand column for every layer we create. All right, so let's add another layer now. I'm going to add the same kind of layer right here, add surface layer. Let's click it. It's going to give us the option to pick. And then I'm going to pick this one right here, Thai beach sand. If I left click it, it'll take a second. And we'll see that it mixed it with the rock underneath it, which is pretty neat. Now, this is where we can start using this first section here, the blend section, in order to get some interesting things to happen. We have it set to blend from below. And if we kick up this threshold, we can see that we can adjust the level of sand quite easily on our object. So that's pretty neat, pretty fast, pretty responsive, looks pretty good. I'm gonna probably go right about here. So we have quite a bit of sand, but still a lot of rock poking up. And again, we have all of those same functions here. We can tile it and offset it, rotate it, all that kind of stuff. We can change the high frequency and low frequency. And we can change the color of the sand by going to its albedo and hitting this button. Okay, so they're all going to have this basic control that we have here. All right, so I'm going to add one more layer, and then we'll start messing around with some of these other types of layers. So first off, let's click here. And then I'm going to come down to this one right here. It says Nordic Moss. Let's left click it. Okay, and its blend mode is from below. And the reason we can't see it right now is because we have to change the threshold a little bit. So as I move the threshold to the right, we'll start to see some of that moss come through. And that looks pretty good. I think that looks pretty cool. And what I'm going for here is I want this moss to be used more like grass. Now I could have gone to online and gotten a grass texture to use, but I'm just using what's in here for free right off the bat without having to do anything. That way you'll be able to use these without having to download anything. But I want to use this moss as grass, not as moss. So if I move this around, you can see that in the moss, since it's a photo scan material, there's a bunch of pine needles and things like that that are going to give away the size of this texture. So if we come right over here where it says tiling, and I'm going to kick the repetitions on the X, I'm going to backspace and hit 6 and enter. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the repetitions on the Y, backspace 6, enter. And we can see that the grass looks like it's further away. Because when we go back into Blender, we're going to use this as a ground texture for a relatively large chunk of ground. And if we tried to use it on a large piece of ground with the size of the moss, it wouldn't quite look right. This looks more like grass from a distance. Okay, cool. So one thing that I want to do again is I want these rocks to poke out more in our displacement. So if we come back and click our rock layer, and then we come down to the low frequency, and let's just poke some of these up and get these to poke up just a little bit. All right, that looks pretty darn cool. All right, so that's about as far as we're going to go with that. Let's talk about some of these other layers. And then let's real quick, though, talk about the blending. If we go back to the Thai beach sand, and then we can change its radius, we'll see that we can get the radius as we increase it. It kind of climbs up the rocks. I want to bring it back down so it's not quite so aggressive up the rocks. I still want to be able to see it on the edges, but I don't want it to be too aggressive. All right, now I'm changing my threshold. All right, that looks pretty good. I'm gonna change the threshold down just a little more. I want to see a little more of the sand. Oh, it kicked the radius up there. Okay, cool. All right, that looks pretty good, and we'll go with that. We can also have it come from above, which we'll do here in just a minute. Okay, cool. So let's move on, and let's try out one of these other layers. I'm not gonna do this atlas or decal layer. You can download things like cracks and other things that have alpha channels or transparencies, and this is how I would put on like a logo or a decal or even some cracks on a wall or something like that. I can download a bunch of those from the Megascan library. So I'm not going to do that for this one, but just be aware that that's one type of layer we can add. Another layer here is called a solid layer, so let's add one of those. Okay, and then the solid layer we see, I'm going to take it to the top. And now we see it goes below everything else. I'm going to change this from below in its blend mode to above. And we can see that now it's coming from above, and now it's above everything. If we come down here and take our threshold down, we'll start to be able to see that we can kind of get kind of a mix there. It's kind of a weird way to do things. I'm going to go back to below. And then let's try our threshold this way. It's a little more challenging to get it to show up here. I'm going to make it show up kind of like so. So we look like we have a little bit of snow on the ground. Okay, so I realize it doesn't really look like snow just yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the color by coming down to its albedo, make sure it's selected. And then let's make it more white. Perfect. Let's apply that. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to use masking. So another powerful part of this is using various masks to get this to look the way we want it to. So I'm going to make sure this is selected, right click, and then I'm going to go down here and add mask stack. Let's click it. Then we see it's not very obvious at first, but this is the controls we want. We have mask components and mask modifiers. If I left click this, I'm going to pick the one that says noise, and then let's just go with Perlin. Now we can see it starts to mask things out a little bit better. Now I have this control center down below where we can change things. So we can have more of it if we want of the mask or less of the mask. So I'm going to do something maybe like so. Frequency, we can change it around like that. Looks pretty good. Octaves, this is going to give us a little bit more control as well. And then lacunarity. It's an unusual term for me to try to pronounce. I don't think I pronounce it very well. Anyways, we can see that breaks it up a little more and starts to look kind of like snow. And then persistence, we can break that up a little more, and it starts to look like we have snow in our scene, which is kind of cool. Now, the cool thing about this is we can come back to our layer here. If we want to, we can come to the opacity, and we can change the level of snow if we want. Okay, so we don't really want snow in our scene, but that would be a quick way that you could get some snow. That's an example of how we could use some masking using a solid layer, and gives us the controls. If we click right on it, we get our controls. So it's pretty neat, pretty powerful. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this layer because we don't need it for our scene. I'm going to right click and then delete layer. Okay, the next type of layer we can add, which is kind of fun, is a liquid layer. So I'm going to go ahead and add a liquid layer. We don't see it again here. We have to go down to its threshold, and as we kick the threshold up, we see all of a sudden we have what looks like a lake or water. And then we can come down and we can change its radius and do a bunch of stuff to it. You have all these other controls, surface, turbidity. We can make it more see-through or less see-through. And then a cool feature is if you watch the rocks right here, we can see that down here under this one that says moist, we can change the threshold, and we can make the moisture go up the rocks. The radius, change the radius of it. We can blur it out a little bit. It's actually pretty neat. So Something fun to play around with. We don't need it in this scene, so I'm going to get rid of it. So let's just click this layer, right click, and delete that layer. Okay, one we're going to use for sure in this though is the next type of layer, which is add a noise layer. So let's go ahead and click it. Now you saw it did something kind of strange to it. If we come over here to its controls, we can see its amplitude. If we kick it up, it's basically going to give us a little bit of noise in our displacement to kind of give us a little bit of change in our ground. Of course, we have all these octaves and lacunarity. I have a hard time pronouncing that for some reason. All right, anyways, mess with that. I'm going to leave it probably about like this because I want a little bit more bump in the displacement, which is all that does. Okay, and finally a paint layer. A paint layer is kind of a fun layer too. We can add a paint layer, and that just allows us to paint on it. I'm not really going to go into that too much here. If you want to see what it does real quick, like I can come to this Nordic moss, and then I can right click, and then I'm going to add a paint mask. Now that brings up our painting tools, which is just what you'd get if you added a paint layer. Adding a paint layer allows us to paint directly on. Adding a paint mask, though, allows us to mask out the this moss and show what's below. So if we come over here to our brush, we can change the softness and all the stuff of our brush. And then if we come down to the bottom, it's kind of cut off a little bit. I'm going to get rid of the brush color, go a little bit further, get rid of the brush jitter, go to brush color, and we see we have a white value to a black value. Right now we have a white value. And then I'm going to change the size of the brush too because it's a little big. And then if I come right here, I can paint out stuff. And it's going to take out that layer and take me down to the level of the layers down below. So I got rid of the moss. You can see the sand, and then it's taking it, cutting it down into the other layer. So it's pretty neat. You can actually just mask out various layers. So I'm going to hit Control Z because I don't want that to happen. And I'm going to get rid of this delete paint mask. Or I'm sorry, I should delete the mask. Okay, cool. So that brings us to the end of this tutorial. This has just been a very quick search through and to see what's going on. A little bit of a how-to, and then we're in the next video we're going to move into Blender and put this on a material or on a plane in the Cycles render engine. Before we do that though, we have to export this, so let's do that real quick. If we come right up to the top here, we can export, and we have all these maps we're about to create, and then we can put these where we want them to be. And here's where we go. Right here we've named it. We can export location. This will be a folder on your desktop or wherever you want to put it. And then export format. We can come down here. I'm going to make it a PNG. You can make it anything you want. PNGs work good in Blender. And then export resolution. Let's click it up to 20 or 4096. And we're ready to go. And we want to make sure that it has all of our maps. We don't need a metalness because there's no metal in here, but we want the rest of these maps. And we'll make sure they all have a check in the box. And then once we're done, we can just come right over here to where it says File, and we can just hit Quick Export. And you can see the shortcut key is Control-Shift-E for export. Okay, I'll see you in the next episode, which will be in Blender, where we put this on in the Cycles render engine. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.